Thank you, everyone, for coming to this session. And I'm sorry there's been a little confusion about the topic. We were supposed to have another panelist, but that has changed. And the theme has changed as well, and we have a very fascinating subject today, pegged to Sarah's book, which was called Behold America, A History of America First and the American Dream. So we're going to talk today about American Dream and America First. But before that, Sarah is a professor in London. She's an American, but has lived for 20 years in England. And she has written on all kinds of subjects, a really wide array, from Marilyn Monroe to F. Scott Fitzgerald, author of The Great Gatsby, and most recently, Donald Trump. So my first question, Sarah, is what is this weird obsession with blondes?
Well, Donald Trump is not a natural blonde. You heard it here first.
Are you sure?
No, I'm not sure. And I wouldn't want to get close enough to prove it. I know it sounds like a very strange assortment of topics to go from Marilyn Monroe to The Great Gatsby to a book about Donald Trump. And I did have a moment myself as I was working on this latest book thinking, you know, I'm inside my own head and I think that's a little weird. And then it hit me that they're actually all three of my major books are about the American dream. Okay. And that without realizing that, I had been writing about that the whole time. Of course, The Great Gatsby as the novel of the American dream, and Scott Fitzgerald as one of the great authors thinking his way through it. But Marilyn Monroe, I truly believe this actually about Marilyn Monroe, that she is one of the great exemplars of the American dream. We don't talk about her that way, mostly because we don't talk about women that way, but I think that we should. She really did come from nowhere, and through hard work and determination and talent and some luck and some beauty and, you know, she got to the very top of her profession, but also she remade herself like a Jay Gatsby, right? She changed her name, she changed her look, she made her ideal self. And that's very much part of the story of the American dream, is that you make your best self and you can reinvent yourself in America. And Marilyn Monroe is a reinvention. So really, in that sense, they kind of all are about the promises and the betrayals of the American dream, but from very different angles. And of course, this latest version of it, the betrayal part, is quite strong.
Is it true that Marilyn Monroe was really very intelligent and she had to sort of, the dumb blonde was all opposed, or is that not true?
Yeah, she was an actress. And so it was a comedic role that she played, and then she was typecast. So then she wasn't allowed to play any other roles. But there's lots of, look, she wasn't very well formally educated. She had to, she never graduated from high school, and she was very sensitive about that. But she was very strongly self-educated. She was very well-read, and she really wanted to learn and to, she once said, I'm all superstructure, but I'm working on the foundations. Oh. That's not the statement of a stupid person.
No, no.
And, you know, there are reasons why she married somebody like Arthur Miller, the great American playwright. She respected people like that. She wanted to learn from them. She wanted to be taken seriously. She had a tremendous sense of humor. She was very, very funny. But she was always uncertain about her own abilities. Okay. So I think, again, that goes to our willingness to sneer at women who are working hard and to assume, and this is true of men, of course, too, that we assume that somebody beautiful can't have anything going on behind the beauty.
Especially if you're blonde.
Especially if you're blonde.
Yes.
For a blonde, you're very smart. I actually had somebody once say that to me.
Oh, really?
Yeah, for a blonde, you're very smart. I was like, so then you're not reassessing your ideas about blondes in that case. You know, it's just you think there's an exception. Okay, so to go back to the American dream. It's a phrase we've all heard, American dream, everybody's chasing the American dream. Sarah, do only Americans dream? Why does no other country have a dream, and why does only America seem to have an American? Why is it such an important part of the American political scripture, in a sense? Yeah. Why is the word dream so important? Yeah, well, I think that, you know, America, of course, likes to make claims about how unique it is. We call it American exceptionalism, right? Yeah. This idea that America's special. And that's a very obnoxious thing for Americans to think in all the obvious ways. But I think that there are a couple of ways in which America, as a political experiment, is unique. in that I think, I'm very happy to be corrected if somebody can give me another example. I think it's the only country in history that only had a series of ideas to bind it together, and it didn't have anything else to bind it together. Not a shared religion, not a shared language, not a shared history, not a shared culture. And so that all the other nations that have been experiments, that have been established as political or cultural or religious experiments, do you think of Israel or the Soviet Union or indeed Pakistan, or they all had various kinds of common cultural, linguistic, and religious backgrounds that made them create that community that they created. I always say that a country that calls itself the United States is worried about whether it's united or not. That there's nothing else uniting it. So America had to invent these values and aspirations that might be able to hold it together across all of the divisions within it that have always been there. And so this idea that America would be, it would be a place where people could realize their own, as we said a minute ago, realize their own best selves and aspire to something greater as individuals, but also that as a society it would aspire to something better. And so that was the American dream of building a better place. It was a utopian ideal.
So it's not just like a material dream, because when it's used, you think of, is the American dream all about having a lovely house, two-car garage, white picket fence? Is it only material, or is there a moral aspect to it?
There's a hugely moral aspect to it, and that's exactly the story that I tell in this book. And trace what I should explain that what the book does is trace the evolution, the genealogy of these two phrases that are so important in American politics right now: the American dream, the very familiar one, and America First, which is now familiar, but a couple of years ago was not so familiar.
Right.
But now, of course, Trump is using it all the time. And so I wanted to go back and to trace where those phrases came from. The American dream is an old idea, but the phrase itself isn't that old, and it has a surprising history, and I wanted to track that history. So most of us, as you say, we associate it with material ambition,
right,
with upward social mobility, with having a bigger house, with every generation doing better than the generation before, with rags to riches, the American success story, any of those kinds of phrases, meritocracy. But when you actually trace the phrase, as I did, I found that those meanings only started to attach to the idea of the American dream after the Second World War, during the Cold War. And there's a 50-year period in which the American dream was in use, and it was being used to talk about the older founding ideals of the nation, of democracy, equality, justice, tolerance, inclusivity, plurality, those ideals that are in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Now, of course, let's just begin by stipulating, by all agreeing, that America never came close to living up to those ideals. We had slavery, for heaven's sake, so we never came anywhere near. But the ideals were good ones, in my view, and in many people's views. And what happened was that as inequality started to take hold about 100 years ago, when American monopoly capitalism, when the tycoons started to really acquire serious private wealth and to consolidate their monopolies, their controls over industry, railroads, steel, finance, J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, these famous names, inequality started to become a real problem for the first time in the United States. And the American dream was coined as a way to talk about that problem of inequality. And they said, in fact, that phrase that we use so much today about the 1% and the 99% was coined at the same time. They said we're coming up to a point where 1% of the country is going to own half the wealth and 99% of the country will be, at levels of poverty or whatever the actual economics were at the time. And what they said was, if we allow this to happen, that will be the death of the American dream. Because the American dream is a dream of equality, of opportunity for the many, not just for the few. And this consolidation of private wealth and inequality, they said, would be the death of the American dream. In fact, one of the earliest examples I found using the phrase in American history comes from 1900, and they said, that multimillionaires would be the death of the American dream. And of course, today, most people would say that multimillionaires are the realization of the American dream. They're the embodiment of it. But in fact, they were saying a multimillionaire is the end of the American dream because that's not egalitarianism, and that the American dream should be about egalitarianism.
Well, talking about the death of the American dream, Donald Trump launched his whole election campaign in 2015 by saying the American dream is dead. And he's also the one who's brought America First, the other slogan, back into the news. So let's listen to a small clip from his inaugural address where he talks about the American dream and America First. May we have the...
And we will always be protected. We will be protected by the great men and women of our military and law enforcement. And most importantly, we will be protected by God. Finally, we must think big and dream even bigger. In America, we understand that a nation is only living as long as it is striving. We will no longer accept politicians who are all talk and no action, constantly complaining, but never doing anything about it. The time for empty talk is over. Now arrives the hour of action. Do not allow anyone to tell you that it cannot be done. No challenge can match the heart and fight and spirit of America. We will not fail. Our country will thrive and prosper again. We stand at the birth of a new millennium, ready to unlock the mysteries of space, to free the earth from the miseries of disease, and to harness the energies, industries, and technologies of tomorrow. A new national pride will stir our souls, lift our sights, and heal our divisions. It's time to remember that old wisdom our soldiers will never forget, that whether we are black or brown or white, we all bleed the same red blood of patriots. We all enjoy the same glorious freedoms, and we all salute the same great American flag. And whether a child is born in the urban sprawl of Detroit or the windswept plains of Nebraska, they look up at the same night sky, they fill their heart with the same dreams, and they are infused with the breath of life by the same almighty Creator.
Thank you. So it goes on for 17 minutes, but I think that's enough.
More than enough.
So, Sarah, Donald Trump talks about America first, and in that same speech, almost like a Roman emperor, he says, a new decree goes out today to the world. America first, America first. And he says, other nations can put themselves first, that's fine. But we will put America first. Now, many people might say, what's so wrong with that? What's so wrong with just stating it very crudely, but what's so wrong with that?
Well, I think most people would say that. Certainly most people who voted for Trump would say that.
Okay. Do you agree?
No, my book is about what's so wrong with that. But the thing is that it's important to say that they didn't know this. So the point of the history that I wrote was to show people what's wrong with America first. But I didn't do so assuming that they knew that and that they went into it knowing that it has this terrible history, and it does have a terrible history.
Can you tell us?
Yeah, so but I just want to, because I think this is an important point. So I think most Americans today think it is an innocently patriotic phrase. But so what I wanted to do was to say this is the equivalent of saying Heil Hitler and thinking that is innocently patriotic. And you need to understand how bad this is and then decide if you really want to support this phrase. It's also important to note that one of the things I do at the end of the book is to show that Donald Trump and his senior advisors do know this history. So they are aware of what they're talking about, and most of the people that they're speaking to don't, but some of the people do, which is why it is what we call a dog whistle. And that's really what I want to do in the book, is to show that it is code and how it works as a code. But most people don't hear it. That's why it's a successful code. So briefly, it's a long and complicated and terrible history. But it's about 100 years old, this phrase. Most people talk about America first as a slogan that emerged with the Second World War, when America was debating whether it would enter the conflict. But it's much older than that. It began several decades before that. Around 1915, it was actually debates about whether we would enter the First World War. And it very quickly got taken up in the name of isolationism, as it sounds, but also xenophobia. It was a time of massive anti-immigration sentiment, and in particular, it was a time when this fairly new idea, nativism, had started to take hold in America, which is basically white nationalism, and basically says, but with a very strong xenophobic aspect to it. So it's partly racism, domestic racism against black and brown Americans who were already there, but it's also a very strongly racialized pushback against any new immigrants coming in who would degrade the racial base and who would dilute the racial purity of European Americans. It was a time, of course, 1915 to 1925, we're talking about, of the rise of eugenic theories around Europe. Of course, it's the time when Hitler was starting to take hold of his ideas of Aryanism. In Britain, it was known as Nordicism, the idea that people from Northern Europe are inherently biologically superior.
Trump said that. Right?
Trump absolutely has said that. He prefers people from Norway to the people from bleep hole countries like Haiti and in Africa. And in America, it was also known as Nordicism. And those ideas that white people are inherently superior, scientific racism, became associated with the moves, the xenophobic moves to purge these new waves of immigrants. And by 1924, what happened was that the most ruthless anti-immigration bill in American history was passed in the name of America First. They debated it on the floor of Congress around ideas of America First. When Calvin Coolidge, who was president, signed it, he said he was signing it for America First. He wrote for Ladies' Home Journal, the very benign magazine, you think. He wrote one of the most eugenicist pieces of, I won't call it literature, but of writing ever produced by an American politician, where he said the races cannot mix. I mean,
was he president?
Yeah. He was vice president when he wrote it, and then he became president. And he was vice president when he said the races should not mix. And they passed this legislation, it was called the National Origins Act. And it put these stringent quotas on people coming into America according to their nation of origin, as the name suggests. And they gave very big quotas to people from Northern Europe, and they massively reduced the quotas from Southern Europe, and they barred people from Asia altogether, so various parts of Asia. So the Chinese had already been completely excluded, the Japanese were all but excluded, and Southern Asia, they were also working very hard at excluding. So I don't know exactly what the numbers were, but they were very small. And it was because of so those quotas were not reversed until 1965 under LBJ. And Jeff Sessions, who until very recently, of course, was Donald Trump's Attorney General, specifically said that he wants to go back to those 1924 America First quotas. And those were eugenicist. Those were simply to keep brown, black, and yellow people, as they saw them, and red people, as they would call the indigenous peoples, out of America and out of power. It was an explicitly ethno-nationalist platform, and that is what America First meant. And it led to a great deal of violence, and it led ultimately to people perishing.
So Sarah, at that time for the vice president to write this, that the races should not mix, it wasn't particularly controversial because there was a law banning marriages.
Yeah.
So for instance, President Obama, his mom married a African. So was that against the law at that time?
No, because the laws had started to change. So the laws about miscegenation, as America refers to it and always has, about mixed race marriage, varies from state to state. And always has. So that's part of the way that we negotiated the great problems created by slavery, and the problems with having free states and slave states. And that's ultimately what caused the Civil War, was the rights of individual states to write their own laws about slavery, about race relations, about how black people and white people could intermix, intermarry, whatever. And it hugely varied depending on what state you were in. But most of those laws were rolled back during the Civil Rights era in the 1950s and 1960s. So by the time that Obama's parents got married, there were still some miscegenation laws in the Deep South, but by and large, they were starting to get overturned. But there are still miscegenation laws in various states in the U.S. They tend not to be enforced, but they could be.
They could be. I was at the American Consulate party. They held a special party at the Hard Rock Cafe when the 2008 elections took place. And when the results were announced and Obama was declared president, I promise you, not a single American in that room was dry-eyed. Everyone was crying. It was such an emotional moment.
It was.
It was something to say. And 8 years later, you have Trump. Now, there's a theory that this is a backlash. Do you agree?
I absolutely think it's a racist backlash, 100%. There are other reasons why it happened. That's not the only reason. But it is absolutely, there's so much evidence that it's a racist backlash, in part, that's one of the reasons why Trump succeeded. And again, that he knew what he was doing with these dog whistles, with saying, I'm a nationalist. Well, there's a specific kind of nationalist that you are. And in America, that idea of nationalism, again, is very strongly racially coded historically. And I think that, there's just so much evidence that people were responding to this, and go back even before Trump got into office, and to your point about his being mixed race and his father being from Kenya, and the idea of nativism that I raised earlier, right? So the idea of nativism is that, white people are native to America, which of course is nonsensical anyway. It wipes out indigenous people and First Nations. It says somehow that European settlers are indigenous, so it's completely a fantasy to begin with. But that's the idea of nativism. And then they say that nobody else is properly American, right?
Not 100%
not
American.
100% American, not pure American.
Right.
And they're complicated ideas that go back to the Constitution, in which, again, with these problems they created for themselves with race-based slavery, what they said was, the Constitution of the United States of America says that black people are 3/5 of a human being.
Right.
That's what it says. And they didn't overturn that until the 14th Amendment, which was after emancipation, after the Civil War. So it was about 100 years later. They finally reversed that with the 14th Amendment, which allowed for birthright citizenship and said that anybody born into America is a full citizen and recognized as a full human being under the law. That, by the way, is the one Donald Trump just announced a few weeks ago he wants to reverse.
Good Lord.
He wants to attack the 14th Amendment. Again, it's very specific. The ones that say that black and brown people are fully citizens, are fully human. So in America, historically, to be 100% American, legally, to have 100% citizenship, you had to be 100% white.
Yeah.
There was a thing called the one-drop rule that said 1 drop of Negro blood made you legally Negro. That meant you were legally subject to slavery during slavery, and it meant you were legally subject to segregation, Jim Crow, lynching after the Civil War. So again, to not be 100% white meant you were not 100% American. And to claim I'm 100% American had to mean you were 100% white. And that's what America First also began to associate itself with. So just think about before Trump got into office, how did he launch his political campaign? The birther movement.
Questioning Obama's
Americanness, because he's black.
Yeah.
Because he has a black father and therefore cannot properly be American and therefore cannot belong in the White House. And, and I don't know if you saw it, but on social media, there was this eruption of racism like I have never seen against Michelle Obama.
After her book or before?
No, book during the presidency.
Oh, yeah.
Calling her an ape and superimposing a gorilla onto her face. And and then when Trump got elected, they all came out of the woodwork in the South and said, at last we'll have a party in the White House.
Yeah.
So what does that say that they think Michelle Obama is? Why is she not a proper lady? And again, it goes to this idea about who's fully American, who's allowed to be there, and they're deeply racially inflected ideas, even if these people don't think of themselves as being overtly racist.
But Sarah, the same country that does all this ape, calls her an ape, and that votes in Donald Trump and has such a solid base, the same country twice voted in Obama.
Absolutely.
Now, how do we explain? I mean, it's that old paradox when America was founded on this great values of liberty and slavery.
Exactly. Exactly. And we've never come to terms with that. We've never come to terms with the real legacy of our racial hatred and violence, and particularly of the way that capitalism in America, that problem of inequality that we began with, is founded on slavery. This is about white people making money out of black people's bodies for generations and continuing to benefit from that today. I mean, people forget or don't know that some of the biggest American companies that we're so familiar with had their origins in slavery. So,
like which ones?
Brooks Brothers, they sold clothes for slaves. That was what they did. Lehman Brothers traded slaves. So we might be glad that they went out of business after all. And they were German Jewish immigrants. But they went to Alabama and they traded slaves. And that was one of the things they did. They were selling cotton. And they got totally involved in the slave trade. So we don't even tell the truth about how the capitalist structures that white Americans still benefit from are built on this immoral legacy, and that what that has done is created a racialized inequality that we have never begun to rebalance, to even acknowledge, let alone rebalance.
In fact, Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, you were a literature professor, right? And now you've moved to history, culture, sociology. And you said one of the hardest things to write about or to research were the lynchings in the American South. Now in India too, in the past few years, the word lynching has been in the headlines because of the cow lynchings. And tell us a little bit about the lynchings in the American South. And
this is very terrible, and I saw some young people come in, so I'm going to speak in somewhat general terms. But the history of lynching of black people in particular, but again, not only black people, Mexicans were lynched, Italians were lynched. Again, that xenophobia comes through. I think when people hear about lynching, they tend to think, nobody's defending it, but they tend to think, oh, it was, one person got grabbed out of a jail and pulled into the woods in the dark of night and he got hanged. And that's terrible. But what actually happened was systemic violence on a scale that I would describe as atrocities.
When was this?
About 100 years ago.
Okay.
The last really bad one was in 1934, so 80 years ago, right before Donald Trump was born, 12 years before he was born.
Okay.
And that's part of the reason why, I wanted to do this, was to go back to this history of the 20s and 30s, because he was born in 1946 and his father was alive during this stuff. And I bring his father into the story. And his father was a eugenicist, and he's talked about how his father taught him eugenicist ideas, and he believes them. He believes that white people are inherently superior. He definitely does. And so I get so upset by that, I got distracted. We were on lynchings, which is also very upsetting. They were between about the end of the Civil War, which was in 1865, but they really started to peak around in the 1880s when Reconstruction started to take hold and black people started to assert their rights. And there was a huge backlash of violence to keep them in their place. And so the real violence was between 1889 and 1922, and then between 1922 and 1934, it continued more sporadically, 1924, say, and then for another decade. So what am I talking? I'm just kind of skirting around it, uncharacteristically, because it is terrible. So in 1915, a man named Jesse Washington was hanged in Texas in front of the Waco City Hall. Sorry, not hanged. He was lynched. I beg your pardon. That's the point. He was not hanged. He was lynched. As I said, it was in front of the City Hall. All of the public officials were watching. There were 10,000 spectators, including children on their school lunch break.
Oh, gosh.
They tortured him, they dismembered him, and they raised and lowered him over a bonfire. They burned him alive. And the one that I'm talking about in 1934 was also where they burned somebody alive. He was also tortured. Historians call these public lynchings or spectacle lynchings because people would come from miles around and they would advertise them. They would print them on flyers and handbills and say, come, they called it extra legal justice.
So it was cold-blooded lynching. It wasn't
Totally
in
cold-blooded.
a mob.
They would wait for days.
Oh, I see.
They would plan it. The local papers would print headlines saying, this is what we're going to do this afternoon. Come out to so-and-so's ranch and watch it happen. And 10,000 people would gather. The reason it finally came to an end was because reporters were going down in 1934 and throughout the 30s, the 20s and 30s. And the one that happened in 1934 was to a man named Claude Neal in Florida. And finally, they put enough pressure on Roosevelt, the Roosevelt administration, that they started to do something about it because the New York Times was running stories about what happened to this man. But until then, there was this conspiracy of silence, and the federal government wouldn't do anything about it. There are postcards. They would take pictures of themselves in front of charred bodies and send them as postcards to their aunties and say, wish you'd been here. They literally would eat popcorn.
Wow.
They burned pregnant women alive. So when people talk about the history of racial violence in America, and they say, oh, that was bad, and we wouldn't want to do that again, I think a lot of people are thinking like those kinds of lynchings, or, I mean, you know, hanging in the woods, or intimidation, like burning crosses and things like that. Again, terrible, nobody is defending them, but it was so much worse than that. And that kind of violence was associated with the Ku Klux Klan.
Yes.
And their slogan was, guess what? America first. That was their slogan, and 100% American.
In fact, in Sarah's book, which is a wonderful book, there's this lovely detail about the Ku Klux Klan. There was a riot in 1927, I think, and 7 men were arrested, 7 Klan members. One person's name was Fred C. Trump, Donald Trump's father. And the best part about it, guess what the C stood for? Can anybody guess what Fred C. Trump stood for? What does C stand for? It's so ironic, but what does C stand for?
You'll never guess.
Come on, someone.
No,
Not
the C stood for Christ.
Fred Christ Trump.
Fred Christ Trump was arrested with, along with 5 Klansmen. Now, there is no evidence that he was a Klansman as such, but there were 20,000 people at this parade where he was arrested, where violence broke out. And one of the things I say in the book is that it is remarkable that out of 20,000 people, only 7 were first arrested, only 6 were eventually arrested, 5 were self-identified Klansmen. They stood up in front of the judge and said, yeah, I'm a member of the Klan. And the 6th was Fred Trump. And the thing I say is that, you know, whatever his relationship with the Klan might have been, we don't know for sure. But his later record does not suggest he was there to protest the Klan, because his later record was virulently racist. When Donald took over the Trump property empire in 1973, that was the year Donald took over as president, and his father was still like chairman of the board or something, the Nixon administration sued them for racial discrimination in their properties in 1973. And one of the things I have pointed out before is that you had to work really hard to get the Nixon administration to sue you for racial discrimination. That was not the first item on their agenda.
No.
Right? So these guys were, Woody Guthrie, you know, the great folklore singer, wrote a song about how racist Fred Trump was, because he lived in one of his tenement buildings in Brooklyn, and he wrote a song called Old Man Trump about how racist he was and how awful it was, right? So whatever Fred Trump's relationship to the Klan was, his racism and his eugenicism is very well established.
So why do people love Donald Trump so much?
Well, they don't know any of this. That's why I wrote the book. No, look, that's obviously, like, I mean...
He is very popular still.
Well, you know, we'll have to see, won't we? I mean, we don't know. There is so much noise right now, and everything is so fluid, right? I mean, it's literally changing on a daily basis. Every morning, you know, wake up and say, what happened today? And it is clear that at least to my mind, that the relationship of the establishment to all of this is shifting very quickly. And suddenly we're seeing legal analysts on CNN saying it is clear that the Trump Corporation has been a 30-year criminal conspiracy.
Yes.
And that wasn't happening a couple of weeks ago. That is going to change the picture. there was a lot of Trump remorse. I mean, I'm sure you know a few. I know a few people, anecdotally, it's not statistical, but a few people who voted for him and instantly said, I regret it. There are people who are still convincing themselves that Hillary would have been worse, which is one of the ways they deal with the dissonance in their head about having done this. Some people still have just swallowed the Kool-Aid. I mean, there is a cultish aspect to Trump. Very clearly, this cult of personality. People believe whatever he says to them. And, I think the people who say that Trump has ventriloquized or given voice to the rage of a group of Americans is absolutely right. And particularly, people keep talking about left and right, but I think that's the wrong way to think about this. It is about elitism and populism. And although he's very rich, he's very good at giving voice to the populist rage at elite power. This, that famous thing where he said, I love the poorly educated.
Yeah.
And everyone in journalism and the media was like, how can an audience like to hear that about themselves?
How condescending.
It sounds to, and we all thought, well, we would hate that, but they actually liked it. And this sense that he's validating a set of experiences that say that your rage and your resentment and your sense that it doesn't matter if you don't have a fancy, highfalutin university education, and he's giving all of that permission. And he's giving permission to those underground movements of violence and racial rage, which did stay alive and were definitely still there. So I don't think that all of America is racist by any stretch of the imagination,
no.
But there are still very strongly racist communities, and he's, again, kind of giving them permission.
How much of it is rooted in fear that, America is not going to always be the #1 global power, China's rising and things like that?
Yeah.
How much of it is rooted in just fear?
Absolutely, and I think it's not even a national fear so much as it is a more local fear of communities who are accustomed to thinking of themselves as the ones who have more or less a direct connection to power or certain kinds of privileges. Even if they're not elites, they're the salt of the earth, or they're the regular Joe, or they're the common man, or I'm the guy that the government is supposed to be listening to, and I say guy advisedly. And now they feel that those prerogatives are being taken away. That, the kind of white, ordinary, working class guy is no longer the salt of the earth or the backbone of the country in the way that he used to be. And suddenly, these women and these black and brown people and these particularly people from, south of the border are demanding other rights and are coming in, and it's all unfair. And, it's only unfair if you think that the privilege that you always had is yours by right. So I think a lot of the fear is economic grievance, but it's cultural grievance, it's racial grievance, it's the sense that things are supposed to be better for me, and they're not better for me, and that's because of all of these people. And of course, ultra-nationalist movements have always been economies of fear and cultures of fear. Fascism has always, that's what it is, the politics of fear. That's what fascism does, is leverage fear. And that's why I think, and so does nationalism, and that's why I think that so many people are, particularly ethno-nationalism, and that's why I think so many people are worried that America's on a slippery slope, because we can see that the strategies and the themes are, parallel, they align.
As an American, when you travel around, do people ask you all the time about Trump, or
Always.
do they ask you things about?
Yeah, all day long, every day.
Really?
It's actually, it's really the real reason why I wrote this book. I was writing a book about Henry James, the author, and then Trump got elected, and I live in England and in London, and I was being asked on an almost daily basis, particularly at the beginning,
I see.
right after the election, to go on, even before he was inaugurated, to go on media, to write articles, to explain it. And I was just doing it constantly, and I thought, well, I better write a book to explain it to myself. And if I'm going to do this every day, I may as well make it my proper job and get on with it and do it right, rather than just doing these kind of bits and bobs. And as I say, I did also want to explain it to myself. But yeah, and I did learn a lot doing the research for this book. A lot of it was harrowing. I wasn't very happy to learn it, but it was important to know. And so yeah, I'm constantly asked to explain Trump, which is a very strange position to find myself in. Since I'm not a fan, as you'll have gathered, I'm not a fan of Donald
He's
Trump.
not your favorite blonde.
He's not my favorite president either.
Who would you rate as your favorite American president?
Oh, that's a really tough question. I mean, look, first of all, we have to recognize that everybody before 1900 was pretty awful. I mean, they were all
Abraham
pretty
Lincoln?
awful. Yeah, he was good. I mean, I'll put him up there. You're right. He's an exception. And actually, he would have to be probably the one, I think, for most Americans, for good reason. But most of them were white supremacists, and before that. And one of the reasons why I would say that Lincoln does get the nod, the trophy, is because he was a former white supremacist who saw how wrong that was. And to do that in the 1860s was really quite a feat of moral imagination. And he did hold the country together. Right. He also modernized our political rhetoric. I mean, the whole idea, we could do a whole thing on the importance of the Gettysburg Address for American political culture. So he's right up there. And I will say, for all of his faults, and his faults are real, I think Obama did a tremendous job. I think he was a spectacular president. He didn't get foreign policy always right. He didn't get domestic policy always right. We can all, identify the things that we would wish in hindsight that he had done better. But he moved the country forward. As you say, it was an incredibly emotional moment for every American when he got, not every American, some of them were emotional for bad reasons, but most of us were emotional for good reasons. And I personally don't think that Donald Trump means that Obama was for naught. I think that what Obama told the editor of The New Yorker, who you write for, David Remnick, a couple of days after Trump's election, he said, history doesn't move in a straight line, it moves in zigzags. And I think that's absolutely right. So, or another, the more common metaphor would be 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, but we're inching our way toward progress. And Obama, a black family in the White House represented tremendous symbolic progress for America and symbolic reparation. And I also think it's important that we remember that, I have think about how young people are entering into American politics now. I have a nephew who just turned 16, and he'll be able to vote in the 2020 election. And he has no problem with a black family in the White House because he has no memory of anything else. His generation's entire political reality is a black family in the White House who never set a foot wrong and who set the standard of civility and decency and discipline and compassion. As I say, even when you disagree with his individual policies, the overall value system that they espoused, and that they clearly lived by. It's not like JFK saying, ask not what your country can do for you, and then going off and, doing whatever he felt like in the back room, and who, by the way, cheated his way into the election. So, JFK was an incredibly problematic president. It's not clear to me that Obama was problematic in the same way. And as I say, I think he set a very, very high bar indeed. And it's one that the Americans who are coming in to vote all grew up with that. And they're more horrified by Trump than we are.
In fact, talking about the first family being a black family, when, their first night in the White House, I think Michelle Obama said, this house was built by slaves. My ancestors built this house, and my children are sleeping in this house tonight. It was the most moving thing, but she was abused for saying that, wasn't she?
Absolutely was abused. They said, no, it was the Irish who built the White House, which is this myth that Americans like to think that slavery wasn't a racist problem, and it was race-based. And she should not have been abused for it, obviously for the obvious reasons, but also because, to me, that is the triumph of the American dream, and that was how she meant it. Was, only in this country do you go from being the descendant of slaves to being in the White House. And maybe it's not true only in this country, but that's the story that America likes to tell itself. And it's still an extraordinary accomplishment.
I think so.
And to do it within a few generations. But then some people still see her as less than human, as illegitimate, and people have been very quick to forget the birther movement, I think, and to say, why do you think Trump is racist? I'm like, well, just remember the birther movement.
Absolutely.
Just start with that. That's how he launched his political career.
Yes, and he went on for 5 years. It wasn't one tweet.
And so did Melania, by the way. So
really?
She is a fellow traveler. Oh yeah, she was on TV espousing birtherism. Oh yeah.
I see. I didn't know that. Okay.
She absolutely was, more than once. She was an absolutely card-carrying, I don't think Obama is a full American, which is an interesting position for an immigrant to take.
Absolutely, and she broke a few rules to get her work visa and things like that.
To get her parents in, but that doesn't count apparently when she does it, it's okay.
I like what you said about, at the end of the day, this is part of the American dream. And when the founding papers were being written, Thomas Jefferson, one
Yeah.
of the great founding fathers. One of his heroes was John Locke, the English philosopher, who said that the goal should be life, liberty, and property.
And property.
And Thomas Jefferson uses that, but he takes property out and he puts in the most beautiful word, happiness.
Pursuit of happiness.
The pursuit of happiness. No other country, I think, has that enshrined in their political...
Exactly.
So
exactly.
can you talk
And
about that a bit?
And that's the dreamer, and that's the point. Is that so? One way of thinking about the history of America has been that it's inexorably been returning to that Lockean notion of property, conflating happiness with property, and saying that money and materialism is the only thing that matters. But Jefferson specifically removed property from the nation's founding assurances and said this is about something more idealistic. This is about a fuller notion of what it could mean to be, we might use words like, a self-realized person or a self-actualized person, to say what does it mean to be, to fulfill your own potential. And property is not the be-all and end-all of that. And so, and also though it's not, he wasn't silly enough to say the country says that you have a right to happiness.
No.
But you have a right to pursue
Pursuit of
happiness.
happiness, yes.
And how you define happiness is up to you. But the country, and that's just really, it's a beautiful idea of liberty, right? Your right to pursue your own happiness is a kind of way of thinking about personal liberty, individual liberty, to determine your own life.
Is it also very selfish? Each person chasing their own happiness?
Well, that certainly seems to be the way it's worked out, doesn't it? I don't think it needs to be. I don't think it needs to be. And again, it's something I talk about in the book. Is that the question is, does your definition of happiness include more than yourself?
Right.
Most of us, I think, would say that our definition of happiness at least includes our loved ones,
family,
our
friends,
families being well and happy. Also, I can't be happy if the people I love are unhappy or ill or starving or whatever. And so there's that, and then most of us would expand and say, but also I want my wider community. I want my friends to be happy. I'm not happy if my best friend is suffering. And then if you can just keep slightly expanding that to say that there's a notion of enlightened self-interest that says that we should think about collective well-being and try to think about what the collective protection of mutual happiness might look like, which is a very complicated thing that no society has ever gotten right. But America has absolutely gone off the deep end into selfish individualism, and that's what we need to correct, in my personal view.
So that's what Bernie Sanders was running on, right?
Yeah.
To get some kind of the whole inequality question.
Yeah.
And that directly impacts the American dream.
Yeah, it does. Because it directly impacts capitalism, right? So the ways in which the American dream has now been conflated with capitalism as if they are one and the same is very, very powerful in the ways that Americans now talk about our society. And Bernie Sanders, I personally don't want him to be president, but I give him a lot.
Why not? Why not?
Personally, I don't. A couple of reasons. I think the way that he, I personally think that what he's talking about is unrealistic for where America is right now. But what I was going to say is I give him a lot of credit for pulling in the direction that he's trying to pull in. And particularly for fighting for campaign finance reform, which is really, really important. I personally don't think that he was very respectful of Hillary or indeed of the women in his campaign.
Okay.
I think that he gave way too much permission to the men in his campaign to harass and bully women, and he wouldn't tell them off. So his reaction to the misogyny among his followers, I'm not calling him a misogynist, but there was a great deal of sexism among his followers, very blatant, very virulent, to me is very similar to the problems that Jeremy Corbyn is having with anti-Semitism in the UK, where his followers are, not all of them, but many of them are virulently anti-Semitic, and Corbyn won't tell them to stop. Sanders did the same thing with sexism. So I have my own problems with Sanders, but I respect what he was trying to do, and is still trying to do, in terms of making America think about collective well-being and not only about individual selfish aims. And I absolutely think he's right that that's where America has to go. Whether he's the person who can get us there is what I personally doubt. But a lot of people will tell me I'm completely wrong, and he's absolutely the guy to get us there.
Well, if you listen to that speech, where Trump's inaugural speech, he says that, where our factories are closing, we need to get our jobs back. The silent people will never be forgotten. You have a voice today. All sounds very good, right?
Yeah, 2 years later, it looks pretty different, though, doesn't it? So my view of that is that the people who voted for Trump absolutely identified the problem. Mm-hmm. The problem is that factories were closing and that nobody was giving them alternatives, but Trump is not the solution to that problem. Donald Trump is the worst possible solution to that problem. So the idea that Donald Trump cares about the little guy is the most laughable thing and that anybody could convince themselves that he cares about the little guy. I was one time doing one of these talks in England, and the interviewer said to me, okay, you've had your fun, talking about how much you don't like Trump. So just in the name of balance, say something good about Trump. And I said, you say something good about Trump. I don't know anything good about Trump. And he said, oh, ha, ha, ha. And I said, I'm not kidding. And then I challenged the audience. And I said, can any one of you tell me one thing that man has ever done that you are aware of that was not for his personal benefit? I don't know of one. When he claims to be doing something philanthropic, he's lying. Mm-hmm. He's not giving the money. Mm-hmm. He's taking the money from somebody else and giving it to them. He puts himself on stage claiming that he's done philanthropic things that he hasn't done. Right. And everything that he has done has been, as I say, for the benefit of him or somebody who has his name, which I think is an extension of him and his profound narcissism. So, I don't think that I literally don't think he has ever done anything generous in his life. Mm-hmm. So the idea that this guy, of all guys, cares about the little people is just, as I say, it's just insane to me. But as I say, I think the problem right, they just got the solution wrong. And I can see why they would think that Hillary Clinton wasn't the solution either. Mm-hmm. But then in that case, do vote for Sanders or somebody like that. But the idea that Trump is your solution, I just find absolutely baffling. But they said they wanted to smash the system, and that he's doing his best.
The one person who really took him on about, what have you done for your country, were the parents of that, the Khans, the parents of the soldier who died. You tell them about that?
Oh, this was so terrible, sorry. There are so many instances on the campaign trail that you would have thought would disqualify him and that nobody would ever take him seriously again. And so the Khans, they were a Gold Star family, which in America means that they lost a loved one, in this case a son, in action. And I think they were first generation immigrants. I think they were the immigrants. From Pakistan. They were from Pakistan themselves, and their son was American. And he served in Iraq and he was killed. Maybe Afghanistan. Yeah, one of those. But he was killed in action. And Trump basically said that he mocked them. Yeah. He went on stage at the Republican National Convention and he made fun of them for having given the speech at the Democratic National Convention about how important it was to them that America was a place where, what had happened when their son died and that they had been welcomed. And he made fun of them. And he said that he didn't think it was true, that the whole thing was made up and their son hadn't really, the typical fake news, whatever. So disrespectful. So disgusting. Yeah, that was a terrible moment. It was a terrible moment, but it was one of 100 terrible moments that he just sailed right through, one after the other. And especially obnoxious was when the parents both spoke. I mean, the father spoke and said, what have you done? What have you sacrificed? And the mother was standing there quietly. And then Trump says, because she's a Muslim woman and not allowed to speak, or some absolute nonsense. She couldn't speak because she was so choked up because she was talking about her son who had just, or her husband was talking about their son who had just died. She wasn't able to speak on this giant stage. And Trump made fun of her and said it's because Muslim women aren't allowed to speak. And then people ask, why how can you call him a racist? I mean, yeah, exactly. Oh, it's just over and over and over again. So as I say, to me, the evidence is so clear of what a despicable human being he is. But so to go back to your question from earlier, how many people still support him? We'll have to see. But the fact is that right now he is a propped up puppet that the GOP is holding up. Mm-hmm. The Republican Party is holding up, and because his base is a minority. Yeah, and shrinking. One thing to remember is people say 50% of the United States voted for Trump, but that is not true. 50% of America didn't vote, so to start with, and he was voted in by 19.8% of the voting population. So 20% of the country, sorry, no, Hillary was 19.8, I think he was 19.3%.
So not even, yeah.
So not even 20% of the country even voted for him, and that's voting age adults. I'm not counting people who are not who are children in those numbers. So 20% only of voting age adults in the United States voted for Donald Trump. So it's actually a minority that voted for him in the first place. And so when they say 80% of Trump supporters still support Trump, it's 80% of the 20% who voted for him. And so the numbers get smaller and smaller and smaller. And it is the Republican Party that's holding him up. So, you know, anyway, as I say, this changes on a daily basis. And 2 weeks ago, I wouldn't have said this, but now I don't think he's going to make it to 2020.
Well,
I don't.
we hope so.
I think he's going to get removed from office. I really do now. And as 2 weeks ago, I would not have said that. Even a week ago. I didn't say it a week ago, but after what's happened the last few days, the Butina thing, the Maria Butina, I think is pronounced, this story, which is just broken, is the House of Cards, and he's going to come crashing down.
On that hopeful note, we throw the
Absolutely.
floor open to questions from the audience. Please raise your hands. And quick questions, please. No speeches.
No speeches. As an American living in UK, Brexit came before Trump. So, you know, did you see sort of reflections of that? What were your reactions? And the second part of this is, you brought up the example of Michelle Obama in the White House. Do you see that again being reflected with Meghan Markle marrying Prince Harry?
That's a really good question. I'll answer the second one first. There was a little bit of racism in the British press in response to Meghan Markle when the engagement was first announced, when they first started dating. And I have to say, Prince Harry, I think, comported himself in exemplary style, and he shut it down. And I haven't seen anything else. Now, that's not to say that people aren't muttering and whispering, and I'm sure there's some on social media. There was a little bit at the wedding. People like Katie Hopkins, that terrible woman, you know, said things. They compared her to Kate Middleton on the wedding day and said, now that's what a beautiful woman looks like, and that kind of thing that, again, is very coded and nasty. But I don't see very much of that personally. The Brexit-Trump parallels are very strong. One of the reasons it looks like they're very strong is because the same people were behind both campaigns. And increasingly, I mean, Bannon was involved in both campaigns. Cambridge Analytica was involved in both campaigns. And increasingly, it looks as if as if Aaron Banks, who's the billionaire who bankrolled Brexit, was also very involved in the Trump campaign. So that's one of the reasons for the similarities. And of course, Farage was also a Trump advisor. But certainly this idea that there were people who were in the heartland who represent some Middle England or Middle America and see themselves as the backbone of the country, but also see themselves as left behind, not listened to, abandoned by the elites. That drives the way that most people on both sides of the Atlantic understand those disruptive elections, but the statistics don't bear it out. It's mostly rich people and old people who voted for Trump and who voted for Brexit. And actually, the people below the poverty line mostly didn't vote for Brexit and mostly didn't vote for Trump. So the parallels are instructive, but the story is more complicated than first meets the eye, and there's a lot more to come out, I fear, as we learn about what was the dark money that was driving all of this.
Any other questions?
I have two quick questions. I think they may be related, I'm not sure. The first one is, since the American dream is something to aspire to in America and something that's positive, why was there such contempt, not currently but earlier, of the nouveau riche at that time? Isn't that a paradox? And the second is what you talked about Marilyn Monroe saying that her foundations were weak, and also the fact that people said Michelle Obama, like they still don't consider her a complete woman or whatever. Is there, so even though they achieved the American dream, and even Gatsby, the fact that they said he's still no one from nowhere, even when he had achieved what he did, does it erase your past, do you think, or?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and I think I agree with you, they're related. And the best way I can answer it is that, again, to talk about what the framers, the founding fathers, said when they wrote the Constitution and the Declaration, they debated, particularly with Alexander Hamilton, about what kind of establishment there should be. Hamilton wanted a monarchical president, right? He wanted a president for life, and so he kind of wanted to recreate an aristocracy. But most of the other founders said, no, we want to get away from the idea of aristocracy and inherited privilege, and we want what they called a natural aristocracy. And that was merit, the idea that merit makes the man. And that was the phrase that they would use, right? So that was the American dream. The American dream was that you, like as Martin Luther King would say many years later, that you would be judged by the content of your character, not by the color of your skin. Now, the founders did judge people by the color of their skin, but the principle that merit would be how you would be measured, not inherited privilege, not inherited position. But that's why inequality mattered so much, and that's why this idea of the American dream got talked about around 1900, 1905, when monopoly capitalism started to gain hold and aristocracy started to be created. And the rich wanted to be treated like aristocrats, and they built themselves mansions, and they started sneering at people with new money, and they just started mimicking the ways of the old world, because that was how they could demonstrate that they were superior. And that's how notions of aristocracy always get embedded, right? I mean, it's something I say in my book about Gatsby, is that the difference between old money and new money is just when you start counting, right? That's all it is. And in America, it cycles very fast. So those ideas 100 years ago, they mattered a lot about whether you were old money or new money, as they did in Britain and in Western Europe in particular. And I know obviously there are parallels here, but it worked, obviously played out in different ways. But the logic that there would be an aristocracy which, this will sound a little bit, might sound a little bit niche, but it's not. A conservative columnist for the New York Times last week wrote saying when George H.W. Bush died, saying that he represented the kind of elite establishment that were born to rule, which is an extraordinary thing for an American to say, that there should be people like Bush who inherited all their money and all their position and their education, and that they should be born to rule. So these ideas of aristocracy, they get replicated. And so you're right, it's a paradox, but the American dream was always supposed to push against that idea. And lately it's been incorporated into it.
Yes, please.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for your time. Two quick questions. First is, if your book reaches the 20% between now and the next election, a very good chance that you might see a different new president. Do you see America actually voting or bringing or electing a woman president anytime, number one. And second is, do we really see America being the dominant power that it used to be, say, between the 60s and the 90s? And what really has gone wrong that, or that needs to be corrected?
Yeah. Well, at the moment, it certainly is not that dominant nation. It can't. It doesn't have a leader who cares about any of that stuff. He doesn't care about the global order. He cares about global destabilization. And he wants to make money out of it. I mean, he's a disaster capitalist. So we're not going to be a leader as long as we have people like that in charge, and the Republican Party is like that too. So could we return to that position? Your guess is as good as mine. It depends a lot on what happens next. If America can, I think of Trump as a cancer we have to cut out, or an allergy that we have to spew out or something. We have to vomit him out of the system. If we can do that and then say, which we have done before, we did after Watergate after all, and say, or indeed after the Civil War, or after the Depression, we got this terribly wrong and we need to correct, and we need to really address where we went wrong and try to fix it. Which we didn't do after the crash in 2008, but we did do after the crash in 1929, for example. Then I think perhaps we could restore those norms, and there are a lot of people who want to do that. Could we elect a woman? I would like to think so, but certainly what happened to Hillary Clinton doesn't make one optimistic. What happens with women running, and this happens a lot in the UK as well, but not quite as badly, is that what they say is, of course, I've got no problem with a woman, just not that woman. And then it's just not that woman, and just not that woman. And no woman is ever good enough and ever measures up. So there are Democrats right now talking about what the 2020 ticket might look like. People want to know who is going to be the Democrat leader. And women, people mention Elizabeth Warren, but she's getting old too, and she's seen as establishment in some ways. The one that people on the left, progressives, are excited about is Kamala Harris, who's a mixed race prosecutor, who did very well in some of the confirmation hearings, and you probably saw her. And so that was when she really made a national impression. Will people vote for a black woman president or vice president before they'll vote for a white woman? I never thought they'd vote for a black man before they voted for a white woman, and I got that wrong. So I'm clearly not the person to ask. My prediction will be incorrect. But what I would say is that that's the political space that we're contesting. And that's why nobody's sure what the outcome will be, because it's a tussle. And we are fighting for a definition of Americanism that some people want to narrow down and restrict in the ways we were talking about earlier, and some people want to be inclusive and plural, and we'll see who wins.
All right.
You know, you said that Trump is a reaction against the Obama years, but what we're really sort of forgetting is that Obama and the 2 terms that he did serve were a reaction against George W. Bush, and everyone was so upset about the 2 terms that he served that they just went all out to elect Obama. So I think there's a little bit of hope. Yeah. I hope that Trump doesn't come in 2020, but even if he does, I know that the next election after that, that there will be a sort of wave after that.
Well, and that is, you know, that was one of the causes of the backlash against Obama that wasn't racist. As I said, I think racism was a major cause, but not the only one. And there was an economic cause to it, which was that Obama's economic policies, and I alluded to the fact that there are things one can criticize about his policies, I do think his economic policies were way too neoliberal. They were way too, you know, favoring of Wall Street in general. And that made him out of touch with the tune of the country. And so the reaction to Trump was actually a reaction against thinking Obama would save us, and then Obama didn't save us either, and these guys are all establishment. And the Bush, Obama, Clinton years, there's nothing to choose between these guys, and Trump successfully positioned himself as an outsider. And that was why they listened to him. They said, he's not a career politician, and all of these guys are career politicians, and we don't trust those guys anymore, and that was how Trump did it. But so I agree, there can be that kind of backlash again, and I think there will be against Trump for sure. I think there will be the passage of very serious laws, campaign reform, and I wouldn't be a bit surprised if there wasn't an amendment to the Constitution after Trump to try to stop some of these things from happening.